Hello everyone and welcome to session 3 of this series. I'm Sophie Bartlett. I'm an education researcher and evaluator. I'm based at the IAU Office of Astronomy for Education and at Cardiff University in the UK. And I recently completed my role as the evaluation lead for a European project called Our Space, Our Future. So today's session will focus on how to evaluate your outreach activities and some of the key considerations you will want to make in doing this. So for the next 30 minutes or so, we'll cover some of the key components of what is involved in evaluation. So what is expected in terms of the evaluation of an outreach project, how to set meaningful objectives, how to frame your project to identify the influential factors, the assumptions and the expectations that your project is based around, who to gather data from and who is best placed to provide that information, so who are your participants in terms of the evaluation collection, and when to gather this data, whether that be either before, during or after your outreach activity. We'll also look at some straightforward methods and techniques for collecting evaluation data that you may want to adopt. And finally, we'll touch upon how we might report the results from your evaluation. And I'm going to use various examples throughout to hopefully provide some context and guide you in your own evaluation planning. So first of all, what do we mean by evaluation? So it has a variety of different meanings that will vary across countries and cultures and scenarios. But here we really mean that evaluation is concerned with how well something works and the extent to which its intended outcomes are achieved. So it captures the value, the efficacy and the effectiveness and impact of something. And that something could be a public science festival or a teacher training event. Evaluation accounts for particulars and the context and environment of the activity. So this can account for cultural and socio-economic factors that surround and will ultimately influence what happens and what takes place. And evaluation is generally more project specific than research usually is. So rather than providing generalizable rules and findings, it aims to provide what we refer to as transferable information. So instead of saying this program works everywhere and in all circumstances, we say this program worked under these circumstances where these processes took place. So before we do anything, evaluation should always start with a clear objective, or you can have multiple objectives, but they should be very well defined before you begin doing anything else. And a common pitfall is people start designing how they're going to evaluate their project and start looking for surveys or tools that they can use to gather feedback data. But they do this before they've set out any specific objectives of what they're hoping to achieve. So what you should do is set out your objectives first, and then your evaluation plan should map against these objectives so that you know you're going to collect appropriate evidence to demonstrate the extent to which your objectives were met. So you may be familiar with the term SMART objectives. So these are a really helpful way of making sure you've kind of finessed the objective and made it clear of what you're trying to achieve. So the S starts for specific, so exactly what it is you're trying to achieve. So you wouldn't just go for an objective of improve astronomy outreach. That could mean any number of things, and improve astronomy outreach in terms of what? In terms of people's knowledge of astronomy or people's interest in astronomy. So make it more specific about what you're trying to do. They should be measurable. So is your objective something that you can capture and measure? Do you have an idea of how you might be able to do this and what tools you'll need to use? It should also be achievable. So is it realistic to your activity or the project that you're doing? Is it likely that you're going to have this level of impact? So often I see projects that set a really highly ambitious objective that is just unachievable in the context that they're applying their project. And what that does is essentially your evaluation ends up showing that your program was perhaps poor and because it didn't reach its objectives, when actually it may have been a very good project and a very good program had we looked at it in a slightly different way. So for example, we're not going to increase the national uptake of astronomy courses through one astronomy event in a little village. That's just not going to happen. So we need to make sure that they are achievable and realistic to what you're doing. The objectives should also be relevant. So does the activity that you're implementing actually address the issues you're trying to influence? And not only is it relevant to what you're trying to do as kind of your mission statement, but is it something that's of use to your audience as well? Will it benefit them? So, for example, an objective of something that is perhaps career related might not be relevant to older adults that are already in their careers and kind of well established in them. And it may also not be relevant to a particularly young age group, so maybe age 5 to 7, you wouldn't start looking at how that you can change their career aspirations. And objectives should also be time limited, so set a clear deadline. If you have a particular program you're implementing, it will likely align to this unless you're planning some kind of follow-up longitudinal evaluation data. So check these kind of 5 SMART elements when setting your objectives, and although it seems quite a tedious process, it really does make it easier when it comes to evaluating and collecting the data itself. So let's look at a specific example. So here we've got an overall aim of to increase teachers' confidence in astronomy teaching. So I've taken this from one of our OAE projects. So that's kind of the overall aim, but like I said, it's quite broad. So we can make that a bit more specific, and instead it's going to be increase teacher training program teachers' confidence in teaching the Earth, Moon, Sun system. So it's particular confidence in a particular area of what they're teaching. We're going to measure it by implementing a survey that measures confidence among the teachers, and we're going to implement it both before and after their training event. It is achievable because the teacher training program focuses on the Earth, Moon, Sun system and different methods and teaching tools that they can use in their classroom to teach these concepts. So it should be achievable in the project setting. It's relevant in the sense that if teachers feel more confident in teaching this subject, they will hopefully use better implementation techniques with students, and they may also share these techniques with their colleagues. And it's going to be time limited. So let's say that the teacher training program runs till the end of November. We are anticipating that their confidence will have increased by the end of that time. So this is just an example of how to set a SMART objective. So now we have a clear objective for the project. We should now begin by constructing an evaluation plan. And a really popular and useful approach is to set out what's called the logic model. And these are essentially a graphic illustration of a project's circumstances, resources, activities, and intended outputs and effects. So they can be displayed very simply, and you may have come across them before, and slightly different variations. In this example, I use 7 components. So we begin with the context. So this is the context and circumstances that are surrounding your project. And it will often include a particular problem that your project is trying to address and remediate. Then we have assumptions. So these are facts or conditions that you assume to be true and that will influence the success of your project. Resources and inputs are elements that exist and are available for contribution to your project. So this includes things like funding, staff time, venue space, things like that. Then we have activity, and this is kind of the key one. This is the project itself, what exactly it is you'll be doing, what actions will be carried out, and how your project will take shape. Then outputs are things that are generated as a direct result of your activity. So you should be able to directly observe these. So these are things that are yielded and produced, such as a particular program, a resource, a website, things like that. And as we're developing our logic model at the start of your project, when we come to the outcomes and impacts, at this stage they're going to be predicted outcomes and impacts. They're not going to be actual ones. So you won't yet know the outcome or impact because you won't have done your project yet. So these are the expectations in that sense. So outcomes are the results of changes that occur as a result of your activity. So they're typically, although not exclusively, related to the audience or the participants that you're engaging with. And you should be able to measure or observe your outcomes. And then impacts are essentially the larger scale inferences that you can make from your activity that result directly from your outcomes. So now we've had a look at the components. So let's look at an example. Let's say we are running a space camp for children aged 9 to 14. The context surrounding this and the motivation for why you put this space camp together is that young people are not choosing to pursue STEM subjects at school. Many of them lack access to dark skies, so perhaps they live in really urban areas. And astronomy is not featured heavy in the curriculum, and young people generally lack understanding of the applications of astronomy. And you'll have some basic assumptions. So you perhaps assume that parents will be looking for activities for their children over the summer break, things to keep them entertained, but that are also educational. Children will be interested in topics of astronomy and space. And you may also assume, although we would never dare to do this here in the UK, that you will have favourable weather to permit some observing nights during the camp. Then, in terms of resources, you have funding from the OAO for your project. You have an experienced delivery team that are very well equipped and prepared to deliver astronomy activities and work with this age group of people. You have access to telescopes and equipment that can be used during the camps, and you perhaps have a pool of volunteers and amateur astronomers to assist in the delivery. Then the activities will of course be the delivery of the summer camp itself. So this could involve multidisciplinary, hands-on, creative activities and observing nights. Whatever you essentially put into your space camp will be part of the activities section. And outputs will essentially include the development of perhaps a series of resources that perhaps can be reused and repackaged for other events. You may develop a bit of a how-to or an itinerary for a space camp and a curriculum that can be used for repeat implementation and used elsewhere. So outcomes, as I said, these are expected. So you perhaps expect that children will enjoy the camp and are enthused by topics of space and astronomy. You expect it will increase their exposure to dark skies, as you've picked a very rural area to have this camp, perfect for observing. They will leave the camp with increased understanding of astronomy and its applications. And then in terms of impact, you may want to distinguish between short, medium and long-term impacts. So particularly longer term if you're kind of looking to gradually upscale your space camp or deliver it on a wider geographical spread. So in the short term, you're perhaps just looking for increased pupil engagement with STEM subjects at their school. In the medium term, as you kind of engage with more people, you perhaps hope that the families will engage more with public STEM activities. So these young people will go home and be very enthused about the topics and the things that they did, and that will encourage their family to attend perhaps more science centres, read more scientific books, watch documentaries, things like that. And then in the long term, if you've had kind of a very big reach in terms of your space camp, you may even look to see an increase in astronomy courses applications. So this is just an example of how a logic model might look. So now we've set out what our evaluation is going to look like for our outreach project, let's get down into some more of the nitty-gritty, and let's first consider who are the best people to provide evaluation data. So who involved in your project will provide you with the most meaningful data that will inform whether or not your objectives have been met. So there are generally, although not exclusively, 4 key participant groups to choose from. The most obvious one of that is your immediate audience. So these are the people who are directly engaged in your activity. But we could also gather data from their family members. So this is particularly relevant when you're engaging with young people. You may find that their parents and carers are a valuable source of information and feedback. We also have stakeholders, so anyone that has some level of involvement or a stake in your outreach activity. And then, of course, you yourself, as the outreach provider, can also provide valuable evaluation information about the delivery and the success of the project, as you were there, you were kind of on the ground. So when deciding who of these is the best to collect data from, and it doesn't need to just be one, you can use multiple, we want to have a consideration of the following. So think back to what your objectives are and who of these people can provide that information. The accessibility of your audience. So sometimes it can be a lot more difficult to engage with young people, particularly if they're very involved in an activity at the time. You may instead prefer to speak to their parent because they're kind of overseeing that, but you're not interrupting them in what they're doing. and also the nature of your activity and how audience are participating. So does it make sense to gather data from certain people when they're involved in your activity? And now, having identified who your potential participants might be, let's consider when might be the best time to gather this data in relation to your project. So there are 5 main time points to consider. So pre, during, post, pre and post, and follow-up. So pre essentially refers to pre-event or pre-intervention data collection. And this is the data that you will collect before your audience has engaged with any of your activities. And it essentially gives you a baseline understanding of your audience. So you can ask about the audience's perceptions, their attitudes, perhaps their understanding, why they decided to attend your event, or what they hope to gain. You can also collect data from them while your event is taking place, so during the activity. And this is useful for gathering information on exactly what your audience is doing, how they're engaging with your event, how they're finding their experiences there in the moment. Then post refers to post-activity, so the data that you collect after your audience has finished engaging with your activity or project. So this gives you an understanding of your audience following their experiences. So you can ask about how they found the event, what they took away from it, whether it met their expectations. Pre and post, when done together, will often involve repeated data collection. So perhaps asking the same questions or using the same methods both before and after the audience has engaged in your event. So collecting data at both of these time points allows you to make a direct comparison and look for any changes and identify any impact of your event on the audience. And it's perhaps quite expected that it's easier to have a short-term impact on your audience and to have them leave your project or your activity excited, enthused, with fresh new knowledge. But you may want to find out if that impact is long-lasting, or if they remember anything from your event later on, perhaps a few months or even a year after they've engaged with your project. So collecting data after time has passed since completing your project is called follow-up data. And where you might do a comparison between pre and post data to see if there's any change, you may also want to do a comparison between post and follow-up data. So are their attitudes still as positive a year on as they were immediately after the event? So now we can look at how we can collect evaluation data and how we can begin to measure the outcomes and the impact of your projects. So methods for data collection in terms of evaluation are primarily either quantitative or qualitative. So what are some of the basic premises of each of them, and when should we use what? So quantitative methods, these are typically numerical, and they are suited to studies that test a particular hypothesis or that seek to measure numerical change. So typical methods in terms of quantitative include tests or closed questionnaires and surveys and numerical observations. So counting how many times you see people do things while they're engaging with your activity. And we have some kind of key advantages and disadvantages in the context of when comparing them to qualitative methods. So quantitative methods are easier to gain representation of a population. You can collect data from more people, so you can make a more generalizable inference from that because you have a better representation. You can do statistical analysis, although only if you have kind of enough numbers of participants here. And this analysis is generally considered rational and scientifically objective. It's quite easy to validate and justify. It's a quicker process, so collecting that data and analysing that data is generally quicker than qualitative methods. And it's easier to replicate. So if you're doing a particular activity over and over again, you can just implement the same survey or the same test, and it's very straightforward to do that. But it's not without its disadvantages. So it's a very rigid and structured approach. So you will only get information from your participants based on the questions you ask. They can't really elaborate or explain their responses, why they've given particular answers, or what their thinking was. It's quite structured in the sense that it's not very natural form of data collection. People know that they're kind of being asked particular questions, and this can sometimes make them acquiesce and provide a response that they think you want to have. And it does require a large number of participants. Like I said, if you want to do any meaningful analysis, you'll need quite a lot of people to give you some data. And it can be subject to confirmation bias. So often people will construct tests or questionnaires that will lead to particular results. So you have to be very careful of this, that you kind of remain indifferent and don't bias your data. So then we have qualitative methods. So this is non-numerical data, so it's much more expressive, and it provides a lot more freedom and autonomy to the participants. And typical methods will include focus groups or interviews with people, and also ethnographic observations. So instead of counting how many times people do things, ethnography is more about watching interactions among people, seeing how they engage with their environment, looking at cultural aspects. It's much more qualitative in nature. But again, we have advantages and disadvantages of qualitative methods. So it does require fewer participants, so it's kind of less breadth but more detail. So although you don't have a big number of people, the ones that you do engage with, you're gathering much more detail and meaningful information, going into much more depth. It allows you to understand a bit more about why things occur, some of the underlying processes, and it exposes you to some of the more subtleties and complexities that are taking place. So it's less structured. It provides a bit more flexibility. You can follow up on certain questions if you get an answer that you weren't expecting. For example, if in an interview someone gives an answer to a particular question that you didn't expect, you can kind of ask them to elaborate or explain that. So it gives you a bit more flexibility there. Unfortunately, it's more time consuming and expensive in the sense that it requires more time and resource to do this, both to gather the data and to analyse it. Again, it's subject to bias, so there's greater difficulty in kind of proving the reliability and the validity of your data collection. It can be very hard to gain representation of the population, but that isn't necessarily your objective here, particularly with evaluation rather than research. We are just looking at a particular circumstance rather than the population as a whole. And it can be difficult to generalise. So again, we're not necessarily looking for generalisability, we're looking to transfer information to other settings. And qualitative methods will allow you to pick up that context and understand why things worked in this situation or why they didn't, and what that might mean for other settings. So let's have a look at some of the key methods and techniques. So one technique that you can use to gather data is called graffiti walls. So this involves using large sheets of poster paper or perhaps individual post-it notes that the audience can write or draw on to share their experiences of an event. And these tend to work best when the audience has prompts to respond to. So instead of just laying out all these pieces of paper, you may have a sentence or a question to prompt them, like, what did you like most about today? What was the most memorable events that happened, things like that. And so these generally work well in in-person events, but as we have shifted so much more to remote engagement now, there are a lot of online tools that permit this as well. So for example, if you're doing an online webinar, there are tools and online software for doing graffiti walls. Mentimeter, there is also a number of different programs, so I know there's one called Kahoot and many others, that are all essentially free online presentation tools that captures audience responses in real time, and also provides kind of a fun and interactive way of gathering feedback. So you can ask questions to them and their contributions are displayed in real time and in different formats. So you can generate a word cloud, or you can produce bar charts, a variety of different graphs. So if you display this kind of on a projector, the audience can kind of see their responses appear and how that relates to other people's responses in the audience. A survey, so that's kind of one of perhaps the most common data collection methods. And these capture structured and specific information from your audience about their attitudes, views, and experiences. And they do permit a variety of formats. So a survey can be both quantitative and qualitative, like either or both. So you can have dichotomous questions, kind of yes or no. You can have rating scales, you can have multiple choice, but you can also have open text responses. You can ask them to elaborate and to describe. So it permits a variety of data collection. You can also do drawings. So this is particularly fun and a very accessible activity, particularly for young audiences and those that may not have certain writing skills or learning difficulties. So you can ask them to draw a variety of different things depending on what information you want to gather. So you may ask them to draw themselves at the event. You may ask them to draw an astronomer to understand what they perceive that role to be. Drawings of their experiences of the day or their favourite part of the outreach activity. So you can gather all kinds of different information based on the prompts that you give them of what to draw. Then we have interviews. These can be one-to-one or they can be carried out in groups. And these are great for capturing detailed information that's also contextualised. So asking them about what particularly happened, why they felt a certain way, what interactions they had. And they're of course a bit more flexible than surveys because they're kind of happening in real time. You haven't already printed off a survey or sent out a survey and then looking at the results already completed. You're kind of gathering the results. You're there, you're seeing it happen. You can tailor the questions that you ask in response to that. And they also provide a bit more autonomy to the participants, so they can kind of guide what information they share with you and kind of take on different trajectories. But that also means you have to be careful that you don't go off on too much of a tangent and that people are giving you the information you need. We also have peer interviews. So these are similar to traditional interviews, but instead of you asking the questions, the participants ask the questions to each other. So this is particularly good again for young people, and it means that participants can perhaps be a bit more relaxed and a bit more candid when they're speaking to their peers than perhaps if they're speaking to you as an outsider or an adult. And then we have tests or concept inventories, and these are essentially the parallel to surveys, but instead of capturing attitude and perception, they capture knowledge and understanding. So again, they're much more structured, and again, they can permit a variety of different techniques. So multiple choice, ratings, open text responses, things like that. And then finally, we have the diary or journal approach. So you can encourage participants to describe and reflect on their experiences of an event. These tend to work best when you have kind of a multiple engagement event. So you're engaging with the same people over and over again. So you can kind of see how their responses change over time. And again, they work best if they're given some prompts about what to share and what to reflect on. So what did you enjoy today? What did you find difficult? What were you particularly good at? Rather than just giving them a blank page. And you can do a variety of different formats. So it doesn't necessarily need to be writing. They can draw, they can make a scrapbook, they can do a podcast or film their diary or journal, whatever you think is suitable or whatever is most comfortable for them. And then finally, once you have all your data and you have reviewed it, you've analysed it, you will of course want or need to report and document your results and your findings in some way. So the OAO don't have specific requirements for how to report this. So it's essentially up to you how you want to format your report. You may wish to prepare a traditional paper report, a written report. You may want to make a poster or a slide deck. You may do a video or a blog post or a website. You can essentially decide how this is done, but regardless of formats, there are some particular things that should be covered and some particular information that you should share. So one, if you've made a logic model, include that in your report. Anything you've already done, put it in there. Demonstrate your work that you've already done. It's really helpful for the funders to see that. State your objectives, so exactly what your SMART objectives were, what you were trying to achieve, but also consider who. So who was your audience, but also who were your evaluation participants. So when we were looking at who you can engage with, these aren't necessarily the same people. So although your audience may be young children, your evaluation participants may have been their parents or carers. So being very explicit about that. And what methods did you use for data collection? Did you use a survey? Did you use interviews? Did you use a combination? And explain a bit about how much data you got. So if you did do surveys, how many responses did you get? If you did interviews, how many did you do? What was the duration of the conversation? Things like that. And when? So when did you collect it? Was it before, during, after? Did you do a follow-up? So giving some background to how you collected your data. Then a key thing that is really important and really valuable is providing your own reflections and your own inferences. So you were there, you were on the ground, you're an expert in doing these outreach activities. Do you think your objectives were met? If so, why? If not, why not? What went wrong? What worked particularly well? What perhaps could have gone better, or would you do slightly differently? Kind of how were barriers overcome? And what will you do next based on how this went? And is there any advice or recommendations you might give to others considering running a similar event? So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of what to include in your evaluation and some things that you need to consider. Our session on this will be on the 21st of September, where we'll have a Q&A and a discussion, and then we'll have a little bit of a workshop where we'll look at some case studies of outreach activities and projects that have been previously funded by the OAO, and we'll have a look into what we might do to evaluate these. And we'll quickly learn that there's no one way of doing it. There's a number of different ways, so it'll be really interesting to see all the different responses we get there. So looking forward to seeing you then. Thank you.